the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So I want to talk about the stories inside the story of our gospel reading today. As we've been working our way through Matthew and through this Holy Week story, there are some powerful stories in this reading that you just heard. I grew up in the country. Our neighbor had chickens. Sounds like a nice thing. I like chickens. They taste really good. They have great dark meat. Their wings are fantastic in garlic sauce. But that was not my experience with chickens as I was growing up, especially about 7 o'clock in the morning, sometimes earlier. Those little buggers were really noisy when you were sleeping. They would wrap you right out of that sleep you had. So the whole point of chickens, although we have this kind of idyllic thing about chickens now, but chickens wake you up, rouse you out of the state that you're in, from fantasy, sleepy, dreamy land to reality, right? I wonder what that crowing sound was like for Peter 2,000 years ago. The dreamy land of thinking, I won't betray Jesus, and then the crowing of that chicken reminding him that he had. Stories are that if you walk through Jerusalem now, as pilgrims do on the week of Holy Week, especially that night of Maundy, Thursday, morning of Good Friday, the sound of the cock crowing is a very bone-chilling sound, a far different sound than we get on our farms nowadays. I'm struck by Peter. Peter is always a character that I have felt like was close to me. All through the scriptures, he's just a guy that I kind of identify with, kind of burly and obtuse and dense, and he sometimes gets it and sometimes doesn't get it, but his heart's always in the right place. He's always wanting to do the right thing. Jesus, all of them may desert you, but I won't. And then Jesus unleashes this totally harsh, critical line. Truly I tell you, this night before the cock crows you will deny me 3 times. I can't imagine the heartbreak that Peter would have felt hearing those words. This guy that just seems to be always so affable and so wanting to do right by Jesus, and then to be the one condemned to the chief of the deserters. It's so heartbreaking. So that's the one story. Peter deserting Jesus, and all the others likewise doing it. But then there's this other story, a little bit earlier, right? Judas. We know Judas historically is like one of the worst people in history. Dante has kind of written this in infamy for us by placing Judas at one of the 3 worst people in the history of the world in the pits of hell in his Divine Comedy. But think about Judas and Peter for that matter. These were longtime followers of Jesus. They loved Jesus. Judas too. They identified Jesus as Messiah and gave their allegiance to him. I mean, these are the guys that walked into Samaritans' houses with Jesus, walked into centurions' houses with Jesus. They followed him from town to town. They were sent out at one point to do Jesus' work, these guys. They were probably just a few days earlier taking off their very own coats and throwing them down on the road in front of Jesus as he walked into Jerusalem. They've prayed with him, they've cried with him, they've laughed with him. And so how heartbreaking is it when we hear these words from Judas about being the one that will betray him? One of you will betray me. Surely not I, Lord. In Matthew's telling, we almost feel sad for Judas, helpless. We can sense his desperation in this story. Surely not I, Lord. And the one who has dipped his hand in the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. And again, Judas, who betrayed him, said, surely not I, Rabbi. And Jesus said, you have said so. These such tragic stories of our own reality, betrayal, desertion, we can identify with these 2 characters, can we not? And so they're so beautifully bookended by what happens in between. And both these 2 guys in Matthew's telling the story and all the disciples are gathered there for this meal. In Matthew's telling, Judas doesn't run off to go somewhere else. At what is about to come, Judas and Peter and all the others are right there around the table as they all experience the communion, the Eucharist, the good gift, the Passover meal. And so this third story, the Passover meal. Do you know the story of the Passover meal and where it comes from, why it was so important? It starts back much further in our scriptures in the book of Exodus. A man named Moses. You've probably heard of Moses' name. Moses was born child of the Hebrews, the Israelites, the slaves as they were in Egypt in those times. There were two groups of people, the slave Hebrews and the Egyptians who controlled them. And Moses was born to the Hebrews, but his mother feared for his life, and so she put him in the river where she knew the royal family of the Egyptians would be coming by. And so she did, and they took Moses into their family, the Egyptians, and they raised him in the court of the Pharaoh, the king. And Moses grew and became an adult, raised in Pharaoh's family. But one day, the story tells us that Moses was out watching the slave masters do their thing with the slave Hebrews, and he saw one of the slave masters really beating on one of the Hebrew men working. And Moses became enraged, and so he took the life of the slave driver, the Egyptian slave driver, killing him. And of course, Pharaoh finds out about it and has to do what Pharaoh has to do. And so rather than killing Moses, he exiles him. He sends him away, never to return to the land of Egypt. And so Moses leaves Egypt and begins a new life. He marries, he has family, and he becomes a shepherd. And one day, while out tending his sheep, he sees a bush that's on fire, but yet not burning. We call it the burning bush, which is always ironic because it wasn't actually burning. And Moses goes up to this bush, and from the bush comes a voice that identifies itself as God, as I am. And God tells Moses that he too, like Moses, hurts for those Hebrew people that have been enslaved back in Egypt. And he too, like Moses, wants them to be free. And so he tells Moses that, lucky you get to be the one to go back and free them on behalf of God. Moses tries arguing like any of us would. But yet he goes back in the end, and he gets an opportunity to be in Pharaoh's presence, and he tells Pharaoh to release the slaves. Pharaoh denies him, and so through Moses, God unleashes 10 plagues. Here they are, in case you didn't know them offhand. They're good ones. Water turns to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, deceased livestock, boils, hail that turns to fire, locusts, darkness. And of those 9 plagues, Pharaoh stays resolute. I will not let your people go, Pharaoh tells Moses, after every one of those. And so finally God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh that the last of the plagues will be that the firstborn of every family, livestock included, will die on that night. The angel of death will pass through and kill the firstborn. And God tells Moses to let the Hebrew people know that if they kill a lamb and put the blood over their doorposts, that angel of death will pass by them and only kill the Egyptians. That night, the Hebrews do as they're told. The angel of death comes and they sit amidst all the death, and the angel of death passes by all them. And the next morning, the Hebrews are freed. Pharaoh says, "Go, leave, be no longer with me." And so this Passover meal is this story of hundreds and hundreds of years of slavery for the Hebrew people, the Israel people, the Jews, until all of a sudden one night God frees them, the Passover. And on that night, that Passover night, thousands of years ago, they ate bread that was quickly baked, unleavened. They ate meat that was barely cooked just so they could use the blood, a meal of haste because tomorrow they're free. It was a meal of freedom, a meal of hopefulness, of praise to God, of God's promise and care of his people. And so every year after that Passover night, the Jews have celebrated that meal right up until Jesus and his disciples. That's what they're doing. I mean, so important was this meal that Jesus and his disciples are even in Jerusalem to celebrate it. Do you see how important this is? So here's this moment. Freedom, praise, hopefulness. They're gathered around this meal. And this is the meal that's placed between a story of desertion and betrayal. It's the story of God not forgetting his wounded people and broken people. Except on this night, Jesus changes the story. Rather than the sacrifice being and coming from the people, sacrificing an animal and spreading its blood over the doorposts, Jesus is now the sacrifice. Lifting up this hastily made remembrance bread, unleavened bread, Jesus declares that now he is the sacrificial lamb. This bread is his body. And I give it to you, Jesus says. Then he does likewise with the wine. He lifts up the cup over his head and declares that the wine is his blood, not the lamb any longer, also sacrificed for them. Though with the wine he declares these amazing words, "This is my blood of the covenant," poured out for the forgiveness of sin. That covenant, that promise, was the covenant that God had made so many years ago with Abraham, and then reaffirmed with Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, that God reaffirmed with his people Israel as they came out of the slavery and found themselves at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God again said, "You are my people, here is my law, live by it." These people have been looking for a way, yearning for a way to be right with God, living the law like it was their job, following the commandments, feeling like the only way to be right with God, to be promised of God's love and compassion, is by following the law, do the law. But again, Jesus reminds them that the covenant is God's covenant. It's God's promises. The promise of love and salvation come from God to us. And with that covenant now, God also offers forgiveness of sin. Beautifully, this story is placed between two horrific moments of betrayal and abandonment. There is God's story of love and forgiveness. Could it be any more beautifully placed when you put those three stories together? Friends, I invite you to read these three stories this week, each day in your devotional lives. Make this story your story. We are a people who can find brokenness and evil that is big and bad all around us, often inside of us. Our own inclination to do and be those things. But in the midst of all of that which is wrong in the world and wrong with us, God reminds us that we are loved not because of what we do, but because of what God does. Because God says, "This is my body, this is my blood for you, so that you may be forgiven." We are extended forgiveness and love and compassion. Thanks be to God and God alone. Amen.